It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in a small southern town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across Main Street as people went about their day. Kids played on sidewalks, shopkeepers swept their storefronts, and cars moved lazily along the roads. It seemed like any ordinary day, but for James Jim Calloway, it would turn out to be anything but. Jim was an older man, his face lined with the marks of time and experience. At 72 years old, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that came from decades of hard work and sacrifice. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam, earning honors and scars, both visible and invisible, that stayed with him long after his return. Now retired, Jim lived alone in a modest home on the edge of town. He spent most of his days tending to his garden or running errands around town, always polite, always humble. But today, fate decided to throw him a curveball. As Jim drove down one of the quieter streets in his battered old pickup truck, he noticed a police car idling near the corner. He didn't think much of it. Officers were often stationed there to monitor traffic. His mind was preoccupied with thoughts of dinner. He'd promised himself a nice bowl of chili once he got back home. What he didn't realize was that this seemingly uneventful drive was about to take a sharp turn. The officer in the patrol car suddenly pulled onto the road behind Jim, lights flashing brightly. Jim sighed and glanced at his rearview mirror, confused. He hadn't been speeding, nor had he run any stop signs. Still, he pulled over carefully, parking his truck by the curb. As the officer approached, Jim rolled down his window, ready to explain whatever misunderstanding had occurred. "License and registration, please," the officer said curtly, his tone clipped and formal. Jim nodded, reaching into his glove compartment for the requested documents. While he fumbled with the papers, the officer's eyes wandered inside the truck. That's when he spotted them, the military dog tags hanging from the rearview mirror. They swayed gently in the breeze coming through the open window, catching the light. "What's your connection to these?" the officer asked, pointing at the dog tags. Jim looked up, surprised by the question. "They're mine," he replied simply. "I served in the Army. 2 tours in Vietnam." Instead of softening, the officer's expression hardened. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," he ordered, his voice firm. Jim hesitated, taken aback. "Officer, is there a problem? I haven't done anything wrong." "You'll need to step out now," the officer repeated, ignoring Jim's protests. Jim tried to comply, but his movements were slow and deliberate. Years of wear and tear on his body had left him with a bad leg, a souvenir from his time in the war. Every step required effort, and climbing out of the truck wasn't easy. Unfortunately, the officer misinterpreted Jim's slowness as defiance. "Sir, you're resisting arrest," he barked, his patience wearing thin. Before Jim could protest further, the officer grabbed his arm and forced him out of the truck. Jim winced in pain but remained calm, refusing to escalate the situation. "I'm not resisting," he said firmly. "I just can't move as fast as I used to." Despite his attempts to reason, the officer handcuffed Jim and placed him in the back of the patrol car. Passers-by stopped to watch, some shaking their heads in disbelief while others muttered under their breath. For Jim, the moment felt surreal. Here he was, a decorated veteran who had risked his life for his country, being treated like a criminal over something as trivial as a broken taillight. At the station, Jim sat silently in a holding cell, his pride wounded but his spirit unbroken. He refused to engage with the officers questioning him, choosing instead to let his silence speak volumes. Meanwhile, one of the arresting officers began processing Jim's personal information, unaware of the storm brewing beyond the walls of the tiny police station. Unbeknownst to everyone present, Jim wasn't just another nameless face in the system. His military service record contained secrets that reached far beyond the confines of this sleepy little town. Secrets so significant that they would soon attract attention from people far more powerful than the local police department. And within minutes, those secrets would set off a chain reaction that no one, not even Jim, could have anticipated. For now, though, Jim sat alone in the cold, sterile cell, replaying the events of the day in his mind. He couldn't help but wonder how things had gone so wrong so quickly. Little did he know the real story was only beginning to unfold. As Jim sat quietly in the holding cell, his mind drifted between frustration and disbelief. How had a simple traffic stop spiraled into this? He replayed the events in his head, trying to pinpoint where things had gone wrong. The officers, tone, the handcuffs, the cold stares from the other cops. It all felt surreal. Jim wasn't one to hold grudges or dwell on injustices, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play here. After all, he'd spent decades serving his country, enduring hardships most people couldn't imagine. Now, in his golden years, he found himself locked up like a common criminal over a broken taillight. Meanwhile, outside the cell, the officers were busy processing Jim's arrest. One of them, a younger deputy named Carter, sat at his desk typing details into the computer system. He entered Jim's name, social security number, driver's license information, and military ID number, all standard procedure for booking. But as soon as he hit submit, something unusual happened. A series of alerts popped up on the screen, blinking red and yellow. Carter frowned, leaning closer to read the notifications. They weren't typical warnings about warrants or outstanding fines. Instead, they referenced federal databases, including ones managed by the Department of Defense, DoD, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. What the? Carter muttered under his breath, unsure what to make of it. He scrolled through the messages, which included phrases like classified status and protected personnel. His confusion deepened when he saw a note instructing him to contact federal authorities immediately if this individual was detained. At first, Carter thought it might be some kind of glitch, perhaps a mix-up with someone else's records. But the more he read, the clearer it became. Whoever James Calloway was, he wasn't your average citizen. Carter glanced nervously toward the holding area, where Jim sat silently in the cell. He called over his partner, Deputy Lisa Morales, who was filling out paperwork nearby. "Hey Lisa, come look at this," he said, pointing at the screen. Lisa walked over, her brow furrowing as she scanned the information. "This can't be right," she said after a moment. "Are you sure you entered everything correctly?" "I double-checked already," Carter replied, shaking his head. "It's legit. Look at the flags, it's not just local stuff, it's DoD-level stuff. And there's an instruction here to notify the FBI ASAP." Lisa hesitated, glancing toward the holding cell again. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her. She had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when things were out of the ordinary, and this was definitely one of those moments. Still, protocol was protocol. "All right," she said finally. "We need to follow the instructions. Let's call the FBI and see what they say." Within minutes, the phone lines were buzzing. Lisa explained the situation to a representative at the FBI field office, providing all the relevant details. On the other end of the line, the agent listened intently before promising immediate action. "Stay put," the agent instructed. "We're sending a team to your location right away." Back at the station, the atmosphere grew tense. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure what to expect next. None of them had ever dealt with anything like this before. Most arrests were straightforward. Drug charges, DUIs, domestic disputes. This was completely different. Who exactly was James Calloway, and why did his name trigger such a high-level response? 30 minutes later, the sound of screeching tires broke the silence outside. Everyone turned toward the window to see 3 unmarked black SUVs pulling into the parking lot. The doors opened and out stepped several men and women dressed in dark suits, their expressions serious and focused. They moved with purpose, heading straight for the entrance of the police station. Inside, the officers scrambled to gather themselves. The lead agent introduced himself as Special Agent Marcus Hale. Tall and imposing, with sharp features and piercing eyes, he commanded attention the moment he walked in. "I'm here for James Calloway," he announced without preamble, his voice firm but calm. "Where is he?" The police chief stepped forward, clearly flustered. "He's in the holding cell," he stammered, "but I don't understand what's going on. Why does the FBI care about this guy?" Agent Hale didn't answer directly. Instead, he motioned for 2 of his agents to accompany him to the holding area. As they approached the cell, Jim looked up, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then Agent Hale addressed him directly. "Mr. Calloway, my name is Special Agent Marcus Hale. You're coming with us." Jim raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "And who are you exactly?" he asked, his tone measured but tinged with skepticism. "Last I checked, I was arrested for a broken taillight." Hale ignored the sarcasm, crouching slightly to meet Jim's gaze through the bars. "Sir, we'll explain everything once we're somewhere secure. For now, trust me when I say this is in your best interest and ours." The police chief, still baffled, tried to interject. "Wait a second. What authority do you have to take him? We've got procedures to follow here." Agent Hale turned to face the chief, his demeanor shifting slightly. "Let me be very clear," he said, his voice low but authoritative. "James Calloway is under federal protection due to his involvement in classified operations during his military service. Your detention of him has triggered national security protocols. If you value your careers and your cooperation with federal agencies, I suggest you hand him over without further delay." The room fell silent. The officers exchanged nervous looks, realizing they were way out of their depth. Slowly, the police chief nodded, signaling for the cell door to be unlocked. As Jim stepped out, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had left marks, Agent Hale offered a small nod of respect. "We'll get you sorted out, Mr. Calloway," he said, "but we need to move quickly." Outside, the FBI agents ushered Jim into one of the waiting SUVs. Before climbing in himself, Hale turned back to address the stunned officers. "We'll send someone to debrief you later," he said. "For now, consider this matter handled, and keep quiet about it. Understood?" The officers nodded mutely, watching as the convoy sped away, leaving them to grapple with the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded. Back inside the station, whispers began to circulate. Who was James Calloway, really? And why had the FBI shown up so fast? The answers remained elusive, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary arrest. For Jim, the ride in the SUV was both unsettling and intriguing. He stared out the window, his mind racing with questions. Whatever secrets he thought he'd left behind in Vietnam seemed determined to follow him home. And as the vehicle sped down the highway, flanked by armed agents, Jim couldn't help but wonder what new chapter of his life was about to begin. The ride in the black SUV was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the agents' radios. Jim sat in the back seat, flanked by two FBI agents who exchanged brief glances but said little. He stared out the tinted window, watching as the familiar streets of his small town gave way to open roads and distant fields. His mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. What had he done, or rather, what had been done to him, that warranted this kind of response? The broken taillight seemed like such a trivial thing now, almost laughable compared to the gravity of the situation unfolding around him. Agent Marcus Hale, sitting in the passenger seat, finally broke the silence. "Mr. Calloway," he began, turning slightly to face Jim, "I understand this must be confusing for you. We'll explain everything once we're somewhere secure, but I need you to trust us, for your own safety." Jim raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but laced with skepticism. "Trust you? After what just happened back there? You'll forgive me if I'm not exactly eager to jump on board without knowing what's going on." Hale nodded, unfazed by Jim's tone. "Fair enough. Let me give you the basics. Your name flagged multiple federal databases when it was entered into the system at the police station. That's why we were alerted so quickly. From what we know, and I can only share so much, right now, you've been involved in operations that are classified at the highest levels. Operations that some people would prefer stayed buried." Jim's jaw tightened. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed aloud sent a chill down his spine. For decades, he'd tried to leave his past behind, burying the memories of Vietnam along with the secrets he'd carried home. Now it seemed those secrets weren't content to stay hidden. "Who flagged me?" Jim asked after a moment. "And why now?" It's been over 40 years since I left the service. That's part of what we're trying to figure out, Hale admitted. Someone accessed restricted files earlier today, files related to your unit, someone who shouldn't have. When your name popped up during the arrest, it triggered automatic alerts. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Jim leaned back in his seat, processing the information. If someone had intentionally flagged him, it meant trouble. A lot of it. And if his past was being dragged back into the light, it wasn't just his life on the line. There were others too. Men and women who had served alongside him, many of whom were still alive but living quiet lives far from the spotlight. People who didn't deserve to have their peace shattered because of decisions made decades ago. As the convoy pulled into a secluded compound surrounded by tall fences and security cameras, Jim felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief because he was no longer stuck in that cramped holding cell, uneasy because he had no idea what came next. The agents escorted him inside, leading him to a conference room where coffee and sandwiches had been laid out on a table. It was a strange gesture, almost too casual given the circumstances. "Make yourself comfortable," Hale said, gesturing toward the food. "We'll get started shortly." Jim ignored the offer, opting instead to pace the room. His leg ached from the day's ordeal, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the possibilities swirling in his mind. Was this about Operation Blackthorn? The covert mission he'd led deep in enemy territory? Or was it something else entirely? Something even he didn't remember? After a few minutes, Hale returned with a folder in hand. He took a seat across, from Jim opening the file carefully. Inside were photographs, documents, and handwritten notes, all marked with red stamps reading, "Classified." Jim recognized some of them immediately. Maps of Vietnam, reconnaissance reports, lists of names he hadn't seen or spoken in decades. "This is sensitive material," Hale warned, leaning forward. "But based on what's happening, we believe you may hold key information that could help us prevent a potential threat." "A threat?" Jim echoed, his voice sharp. "What kind of threat?" Hale hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "We don't know yet. But whoever accessed these files knows enough to pose a risk, not just to national security but to individuals connected to your unit, including you." Jim's chest tightened. He'd always known that his time in Vietnam came with risks, even after returning home. But he'd hoped those days were long behind him. Apparently, hope wasn't enough. "What do you want from me?" Jim asked bluntly. "We need your cooperation," Hale replied. "Your knowledge of these operations and the people involved could be crucial in identifying who's behind this breach. In exchange, we'll ensure your protection." Protection. The word hung heavy in the air. Jim thought about his quiet life, his garden, his morning walks to the store. Could he really go back to that after all this? Or was he destined to relive the ghosts of his past indefinitely? As the conversation continued, Hale revealed more details about the breach. Someone had hacked into a secure database maintained, jointly by the Department of Defense and the CIA. The intruder hadn't just accessed random files, they'd targeted specific ones, including records tied to Jim's unit. Whoever they were, they had resources, skills, and likely connections within powerful circles. "You think they're coming for me?" Jim said, his voice steady despite the weight of the realization. "It's possible," Hale admitted. "Which is why we're moving you to a safe location until we can assess the situation fully. We'll also provide you with a detail of agents to ensure your safety." Jim nodded slowly, though his expression remained guarded. He appreciated the effort, but he'd learned long ago not to rely solely on others for protection. Survival required vigilance, and Jim had plenty of practice in that department. Before leaving the compound, Hale handed Jim a burner phone. "Use this if you need to contact us directly," he instructed. "Don't use your personal number. It may already be compromised." Jim accepted the phone reluctantly, slipping it into his pocket. As the agents prepared to escort him to another vehicle, he paused, turning back to Hale. "One more thing," he said. "If you're asking me to dig up the past, I'll need access to something. Something I kept hidden for a reason. What is it? Hale asked, his curiosity piqued. A box, Jim replied. It's at my house. Contains items from my time in Vietnam. Letters, photos, notes. Some of it might be useful to you, but if anyone else finds it... Hale understood immediately. We'll retrieve it, he assured Jim. No one else gets near it. With that promise, Jim climbed into the waiting car, his mind racing with new questions and old fears. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was clear. The life he'd worked so hard to build was about to change forever, and while he couldn't control the forces closing in around him, he could decide how he faced them. For better or worse, James Calloway was ready to confront his past head-on. The sun had long dipped below the horizon by the time Jim arrived at his modest home, flanked by FBI agents who moved with precision and purpose. To an outsider, it might have looked like a scene from a movie, a convoy of black SUVs pulling up to a small weathered house on the edge of town. But for Jim, it was surreal. This was his sanctuary, the place where he'd spent years trying to leave the chaos of his past behind. Now that same past was forcing its way back in. As the agent secured the perimeter, Jim stood on the porch, staring at the familiar creaky steps and peeling paint. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember simpler times, the smell of fresh cut, grass in the summer, the sound of birds chirping at dawn. But those memories were quickly overshadowed by the weight of what he was about to do. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, followed closely by Agent Hale and two other agents. The house was exactly as Jim had left it earlier that day, quiet, orderly, unassuming. The living room was sparsely furnished, with a worn recliner, facing the television and a stack of old books on the side table. A photo of Jim in his army uniform hung on the wall, faded but still proud. It was a reminder of who he once was, and perhaps who he was becoming again. Jim led the group to a closet near the back of the house. Kneeling down, he pushed aside a few boxes of tools and spare parts until he reached a dusty wooden chest tucked away in the corner. The box was plain, its surface scratched and worn from years of use, but it carried a significance that went far beyond its appearance. As Jim opened it, the faint scent of aged paper and leather wafted into the air. Inside were relics of another life, medals tarnished with age, letters yellowed at the edges, black and white photographs of young men smiling despite the horrors they faced. There were also documents, handwritten notes, maps, and coded messages that only someone with intimate knowledge of Jim's unit would understand. Among these items lay a single sheet of paper folded neatly at the bottom of the box. Jim hesitated, before picking it up, his fingers brushing against the fragile paper as if afraid it might crumble in his hands. "This is it," Jim said quietly, handing the note to Agent Hale. "It's a message we received during Operation Blackthorn. We never fully decoded it. It didn't make sense at the time. But maybe now." Hale unfolded the paper carefully, scanning the cryptic symbols and numbers scrawled across it. His brow furrowed as he studied the markings, recognizing elements of military encryption techniques used during the Vietnam era. "This could be important," he murmured, slipping the note into a protective sleeve. "Our analysts will take a closer look." While the agents collected the contents of the box, Jim wandered into the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, fear, determination, all battling for dominance. He knew the stakes were high, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him. Others were involved, others who had trusted him to keep their secrets safe. What would happen to them if those secrets came to light? Back at the compound, the mood was tense. Analysts worked tirelessly to decipher the note, cross-referencing it with declassified records and intelligence reports. Meanwhile, cybersecurity. Teams traced the breach in the federal database following a trail of digital breadcrumbs that led to shadowy corners of the internet. Every discovery raised more questions than answers, and the clock was ticking. That evening, as Jim sat in a secure room reviewing case files with Agent Hale, the burner phone in his pocket buzzed unexpectedly. Startled, Jim pulled it out and glanced at the screen. The number was blocked. He exchanged a wary look with Hale before answering cautiously. "Hello?" A low, distorted voice crackled through the speaker. "James Calloway, you should have stayed quiet." Jim's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the chill running down his spine. "You know what you did," the voice continued, ignoring his question. "Keep your mouth shut or there'll be consequences for you and for others." The line went dead before Jim could respond. He stared at the phone, his heart pounding. Hale immediately sprang into action, signaling for technical support to trace the call. "Did you recognize the voice?" he asked, his tone urgent. "No," Jim replied, shaking his head. "But whoever it is knows enough to threaten me personally, and they're not bluffing." Hale nodded grimly. "We'll find them. Until then, your safety is our top priority." Despite the reassurances, Jim couldn't shake the ominous warning. The caller's words echoed in his mind, dredging up memories he'd tried so hard to bury. Faces of comrades flashed before his eyes. Men and women who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the jungles of Vietnam. Some had made it home, others hadn't. All had shared in the burden of secrecy. The next morning, the FBI team convened to discuss their findings. The note from Jim's box contained fragments of coordinates pointing to an abandoned airstrip in Louisiana. Satellite imagery revealed signs of recent activity in the area. Tire tracks, footprints, and makeshift shelters, hidden beneath dense foliage. It was clear that someone had been there recently, and they weren't casual visitors. "We need to check it out," Hale said, addressing the group. "If there's evidence tying this location to Jim's unit, or to whoever hacked the database, it could be the break we need." Jim listened intently, weighing the risks. He knew better than anyone how dangerous such missions could be. Yet he also understood the importance of uncovering the truth, not just for himself but for everyone affected by whatever conspiracy was unfolding. After a moment's hesitation, he spoke up. "I'm coming with you." Hale frowned, clearly reluctant. "Mr. Calloway, this isn't a decision to take lightly. It's too dangerous. And letting someone else handle it makes it safer," Jim countered, his voice firm. "Agent Hale, I've been in situations like this before. If you want answers, I can help you find them. Besides..." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "If something happens, I owe it to my team to see this through." Reluctantly, Hale agreed, though he insisted on additional security measures. Plans were set in motion to visit the airstrip under the cover of darkness, armed with equipment to document and preserve any evidence they found. As preparations began, Jim retreated to his quarters, steeling himself for what lay ahead. Meanwhile, back in the small southern town where it all began, tensions simmered. News of Jim's dramatic arrest and subsequent rescue by the FBI had spread like wildfire. Local residents debated the story over coffee and dinner tables, some expressing outrage at the treatment Jim had endured, while others dismissed it as paranoia. Deputy Lisa Morales, however, refused to let the matter rest. She pored over arrest reports, questioning inconsistencies and pushing for accountability within the department. Her efforts sparked uncomfortable conversations about systemic issues that had long gone unaddressed. For Jim, the days blurred together as he prepared for the trip to Louisiana. Each step brought him closer to confronting the ghosts of his past, yet further from the quiet life he'd built. Still, he remained resolute. Whatever awaited him at the airstrip, he was ready to face it head-on. For the first time in decades, James Calloway felt alive, not because of danger, but because of purpose. The journey to the abandoned airstrip in Louisiana was anything but ordinary. Jim sat in the back of another black SUV, flanked by Agent Hale and 2 other FBI operatives. The convoy consisted of 3 vehicles, each equipped with advanced communication systems and armed personnel. Despite the high-tech gear and tactical precision surrounding him, Jim's mind kept drifting back to simpler times. Times when he didn't have to think about encrypted notes, hidden airstrips, or shadowy threats lurking in the dark. As they drove deeper into the bayou country, the landscape shifted dramatically. Towering trees draped in Spanish moss loomed over narrow dirt roads, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. The air grew thick and humid, carrying the faint scent of swamp water and decaying leaves. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, untouched by modernity, or so it appeared on the surface. When the convoy finally pulled off the main road onto an even narrower path leading to the airstrip, Jim felt his pulse quicken. He had been here before, or at least somewhere like it. During his time in Vietnam, he'd scouted countless remote locations just like this one, isolated, forgotten, perfect for covert operations. Memories flooded back unbidden, the sound of helicopters cutting through dense jungle skies, the tension of waiting for orders, the camaraderie of soldiers bound together by shared danger. Shaking his head slightly, Jim forced himself to focus on the present. This wasn't Vietnam. This was now, and the stakes were different, but no less deadly. The team parked a safe distance away from the airstrip, cloaked by dense foliage. They moved silently through the underbrush, guided by night vision goggles and infrared scanners. Jim walked alongside Agent Hale, his limp more pronounced due to the uneven terrain, but his determination unwavering. Every step reminded him of why. He was here, not just for answers, but for justice. Justice for those who had trusted him, fought beside him, and sometimes died because of decisions made beyond their control. When they reached the edge of the clearing, the sight before them confirmed their suspicions. The airstrip, though long, abandoned, showed clear signs of recent activity. Tents made of camouflage netting blended seamlessly with the surroundings, and tire tracks crisscrossed the cracked asphalt runway. Scattered around were remnants of supplies, empty crates, discarded tarps, and even a few pieces of equipment that looked suspiciously military-grade. "Looks like we're not the first ones here," Hale whispered, motioning for the team to fan out and secure the area. Jim nodded grimly, scanning the scene with sharp eyes. Something about the setup felt familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. Then he spotted it, a makeshift marker etched into the ground near one of the tents. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, but Jim recognized it immediately. It was a symbol used by his unit during Operation Blackthorn, a way to mark safe zones or rendezvous points. "This is it," Jim murmured, pointing toward the marker. "They've been using our old codes." Hale crouched beside him, studying the symbol closely. "Are you sure?" "I'm positive," Jim replied, his voice tight with emotion. "Whoever's behind this knows enough about us to exploit our methods. They're sending a message." The team worked quickly, gathering evidence while maintaining constant vigilance for any signs of movement. Inside the tents, they discovered stacks of documents, maps, and encrypted files, all bearing hallmarks of classified material. Some of the papers referenced names Jim hadn't heard in decades, former comrades, commanding officers, and even civilians connected to the operation. Others hinted at something far more sinister, an intricate web of corruption involving powerful figures tied to Jim's unit. One document in particular caught Jim's attention. It was a ledger detailing illicit arms deals brokered during the war, complete with signatures and dates. As he flipped through the pages, a name jumped out at him, one he hadn't expected to see. Colonel Richard Grayson, a decorated officer who had led Jim's unit during Blackthorn. Grayson had always been a polarizing figure, admired by some for his strategic brilliance and despised by others for his ruthless tactics. What Jim saw now painted a very different picture of the man he once respected. "Grayson?" Hale asked when Jim pointed out the name. "You think he's involved?" "I don't know," Jim admitted, shaking his head. "But if these records are legit, then he wasn't just running missions. He was running businesses, illegal ones. And whoever hacked the database must have uncovered this too." As dawn approached, the team finished cataloging the evidence and prepared to leave. But as they retraced their steps through the swampy woods, a sudden noise froze them in their tracks. A twig snapped nearby, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through dry leaves. Everyone dropped, low, weapons drawn, as shadows moved between the trees. "Stay calm," Hale instructed quietly, his gaze locked on the darkness ahead. We don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Jim's heart raced as he scanned the area, his instincts screaming at him to move. Years of combat training kicked in, and he positioned himself protectively near the younger agents. If trouble came, he wouldn't let anyone else take the fall for him. Then, without warning, a figure emerged from the shadows, a lone man dressed in civilian clothes, hands raised in surrender. He looked terrified, his face pale and streaked with mud. "Please," he cried, his voice trembling. "I'm not armed. I swear." Agent Hale signaled for the team to lower their weapons cautiously. "Who are you?" he demanded, stepping forward. "My name's Daniel," the man stammered. I work for Colonel Grayson, or I did, until I found out what he's really doing." Jim exchanged a glance with Hale, suspicion mingling with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Jim pressed, his tone firm but controlled. Daniel hesitated, glancing nervously at the surrounding agents. "It's bigger than anyone realizes. Grayson's been using old connections, people from your unit, to funnel money and weapons overseas. He's got friends in high places, people who'll do anything to protect him. When I started asking questions, they came after me. I barely escaped." The weight of Daniel's words settled heavily over the group. Jim clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. All those years ago he'd trusted Grayson implicitly, believing in the mission and the men leading it. Now it seemed that trust had been misplaced. Worse still, the betrayal extended far beyond one man. It implicated an entire network of power players willing to sacrifice lives for profit. "We need to get you somewhere safe," Hale said to Daniel, ushering him toward the vehicles. "You can tell us everything once we're back at base." As they made their way back to the convoy, Jim couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs amplifying his unease. Still, they reached the vehicles, without incident, piling in quickly before speeding away from the eerie airstrip. Back at the compound, the debriefing stretched late into the night. Daniel provided detailed accounts of Grayson's operations, corroborating much of what the team had already uncovered. Meanwhile, analysts worked tirelessly to decode the remaining files, piecing together a timeline of corruption that spanned decades. Each revelation painted a clearer picture of the conspiracy, but also deepened the mystery of who exactly was orchestrating it all. For Jim, the day had been emotionally exhausting. The betrayal cut deep, reopening wounds he thought had healed long ago. Yet amidst the pain there was resolve. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could fight to expose the truth and ensure that those responsible paid for their crimes. As dawn broke over the horizon, casting golden light across the compound, Jim stood outside, staring at the rising sun. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel hope, not just for himself, but for everyone whose lives had been touched by the shadows of war. Whatever came next, he was ready. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity, both for Jim and the FBI team. Evidence collected from the abandoned airstrip was meticulously analyzed, cross-referenced, and pieced together like fragments of a puzzle. Analysts worked around the clock, unraveling threads of corruption that stretched far beyond Colonel Grayson's illicit arms deals. What they uncovered painted a grim picture. A sprawling network of powerful individuals, politicians, corporate executives, and military officials who had exploited classified operations for personal gain. The deeper they dug, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about one man or one unit. It was systemic, spanning decades and continents. For Jim, the revelations hit hard. Every piece of evidence tied back to people he'd trusted, missions he'd believed in, and sacrifices he'd made. Men and women who had fought alongside him weren't just casualties of war. They were pawns in a much larger game. Some had died honorably. Others had been silenced when they got too close to the truth. And now Jim found himself at the center of an effort to expose it all. Agent Hale sat with Jim late one night reviewing the findings. "This is going to be big," Hale said, his voice low but steady. "Bigger than any of us anticipated. When we present this to Congress, and we will, it's going to shake things up." Jim nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't sign up for this," he admitted, gesturing toward the piles of documents and files spread across the table. "When I joined the Army, I thought I was serving my country, protecting people. Not this. No one signs up expecting something like this," Hale replied, his tone sympathetic yet firm. "But here you are, Mr. Calloway. You've got a chance to make things right, to honor the memory of everyone who served under your command. Are you ready for that?" Jim didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as if searching for answers written in the cracks. After a long pause, he exhaled deeply and met Hale's gaze. "If this is what it takes, then yes, I'm ready." In the small southern town where it all began, life continued as usual, or so it seemed on the surface. The wrongful arrest of James Calloway had sparked outrage among residents, many of whom rallied behind him after learning about his service record and the circumstances surrounding the incident. Local news outlets picked up the story, shining a spotlight on issues of racial profiling and police misconduct. Deputy Lisa Morales emerged as an unlikely advocate for change within the department, pushing for reforms while confronting her colleagues about their biases. One evening, after another heated meeting with the police chief, Lisa received an unexpected visitor, Agent Marcus Hale. Dressed in plain clothes, he introduced himself and explained why he was there. "We're grateful for your cooperation during the investigation," Hale said, handing her a folder. "This contains information relevant to your inquiry into the arrest. Use it wisely." Lisa opened the folder cautiously, scanning the contents. Her eyes widened as she realized what she was holding: transcripts of communications between local law enforcement and federal agencies, along with notes detailing how Jim's arrest had triggered national security protocols. "Why are you giving me this?" she asked, stunned. "Because justice starts at home," Hale replied simply. "Your department has work to do. Consider this a starting point." As Hale left, Lisa sat alone in her office, overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also understood the importance of accountability. For too long, injustices had gone unchecked. Now, armed with new insights and determination, she vowed to fight for transparency, not just for Jim, but for everyone affected by systemic failures. Back at the FBI compound, preparations were underway for Jim's testimony before Congress. It was a daunting prospect even for someone as resilient as Jim. Testifying meant reliving painful memories, exposing secrets he'd sworn to protect, and facing adversaries who would stop at nothing to silence him. But Jim refused to let fear dictate his actions. With Hale's guidance, he rehearsed his statements, reviewed evidence, and mentally prepared for the challenges ahead. On the day of the hearing, Jim dressed in his best suit, a nod to the dignity of the occasion. As he walked into the packed committee room, flanked by federal agents, he felt a mix of nerves and resolve. Rows of senators and representatives sat before him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing every moment for the world to see. When Jim took the stand, the room fell silent. He began by recounting his experiences in Vietnam, the camaraderie, the sacrifices, the trust he placed in his superiors. Then his voice hardened as he described the betrayal he'd uncovered, the corruption, the exploitation, the lives destroyed in pursuit of greed. His words carried the weight of truth, resonating with everyone present. "This isn't just about me," Jim concluded, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "It's about honoring those who gave everything, for their families, for their country, and for ideals they believed in. We owe them justice, and today I ask you to deliver it." The room erupted in applause, though Jim barely noticed. He focused instead on the faces of the lawmakers, searching for signs of understanding and commitment. To his relief, many appeared moved by his testimony. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift and significant. Congressional hearings led to investigations, which in turn prompted arrests. Colonel Grayson and several high-ranking officials were indicted on charges of conspiracy, corruption, and abuse of power. Media coverage brought widespread attention to the case, igniting debates about accountability and reform within government institutions. For Jim, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such upheaval. He declined offers for interviews and public appearances, choosing instead to retreat to the quiet comfort of his home. Yet he remained active behind the scenes, working with advocacy groups to support veterans and promote transparency in military operations. His garden flourished once again, a testament to resilience and renewal. One evening, as Jim sat on his porch watching the sunset, Agent Hale paid him a visit. "Just wanted to check in," Hale said, leaning against the railing. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better," Jim admitted with a small smile. "But I'm okay. More than okay, actually. Feels good to know we made a difference." Hale nodded approvingly. "You did more than most people ever will. Take pride in that." As the two men talked, the sky blazed with hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. Jim allowed himself a rare moment of peace, knowing that despite the scars of his past, he had finally found closure. Justice hadn't come easily, but it had come, and that was enough. And somewhere deep inside, Jim felt a sense of gratitude, not just for the allies he'd gained along the way, but for the strength he'd discovered within himself. Though the journey had been long and difficult, it had reminded him of something important. Even in the face of injustice, hope and courage could light the path forward.